Hey geography class, today we are going to be talking about human geography, specifically in two of the four subregions of Latin America. These two being Mexico and then Central America mixed in with the Caribbean. Those are the two specific subregions that we're going to look at with human geography. We're going to start with Mexico. At Mexico, or present-day Mexico as we know it today, was at one time occupied by three different native groups. Those three different native groups were the Aztecs, the Toltecs, and the Mayans. And I'm sure a lot of you have a lot of questions about the Mayans because of the Mayan calendar that supposedly ends on December 2012. And we'll get into that discussion in class, but I wouldn't be too worried about it because a lot of people disprove those theories. Those regions, especially the Aztecs, came into trouble in 1519 when Hernando Cortez landed on the coast of Mexico. And one thing he did was the Spanish conquest, and that actually took over the Aztec city of Tenochtitlan. And you can see that city right there, and that's present-day Mexico City. Cortez and his men were able to conquer the Aztecs during this raid in 1519. So at that time, when Cortez took it over, Mexico belonged to the Spanish Empire, and they belonged to them for many centuries after the conquest. The reason most people wanted Mexico at that time is because they had a lot of silver and gold, so it was a very profitable investment to have. However, the Mexicans were ultimately able to gain their independence in 1821. They gained their independence under Agustin de Iturbide, and that's the guy right there, Iturbide, who became the Mexican emperor in 1822. Land was a really big issue early in Mexico. One of the reasons land was such a big issue at this time is because there was a lot of it and there was only a few landowners that owned a majority of the available land. We called those people the haciendas. Benito Juarez was the first Mexican president, and he tried to change this whole landowning issue and the landowning regulations. Porfirio Diaz came after Juarez, and his rule was really strict and unpopular among many of the Mexican people. A civil war actually broke out while Diaz was in charge, and a new constitution was adopted in 1917. This new constitution redistributed much of the land among the peasants, and the peasants were people who worked the haciendas before the redistribution. So there was a whole bunch of land and a few amount of people that owned them, but there was a lot of people, and that's what Juarez tried to do, was to get more people to own more land so they could get more money. Diaz kind of struggled with that, led to a civil war, but in the end we did get more people owning more land in Mexico, which really helped the economy and the people there. That leads us into 1929 and the development of the Institutional Revolutionary Party. Their main goal was to introduce democracy into Mexico. They also wanted to maintain political stability and redistribute more of the land to the peasants, something that Juarez tried on that last slide I showed you. This party really lasted until the 2000s, when it was finally defeated by the National Action Party after 71 years of being in control. So we had the Institutional Revolutionary Party, which is the PRI, so it's backwards, and they were in charge for 71 years trying to get their things, and corruption eventually led to the National Action Plan, which is backwards, is PAN, in the 2000s, which let them take control. And they were more of a democratic party, so now they took control after 71 years. When we look at the culture of Mexico, it's really a mix between the ancient civilizations that we talked about earlier, like the Aztecs, and then the Spanish, because the Spanish did come and conquer them and were in control of them for a long time. So those two societies really blended to make the culture like we have it today. The ancient city of Tenochtitlan, like I said, is now Mexico City, and you can specifically see the blend of the Spanish and the Native American cultures in that city. Because of that diverse mix in culture, we see a large mestizo population in Mexico today. A mestizo is a mix of Spanish and Native American heritage. This mix can also be seen through the name Mexico, because Mexico comes from Mexica, which is an old name for the Aztecs. So really all the words and all the culture and heritage of this can either be traced back to the Native Americans or the Spanish that conquered them and took over their land. Mexican culture also has a long heritage and history of architecture and art. Paintings are very popular in Mexico, and they're the center of Mexican heritage, and they have a blend of European and Native American influences. Frida Kahlo, she's a famous painter, and if you ever seen Mexican paintings, you'd see a lot of her works, and I have a couple images of her on this slide. And the buildings, the architecture in the bottom is very important in Mexico. It starts with the pyramids that the Aztecs had built. Then we have missions, and these missions were built by the Spanish that came over and took over the Aztecs. They tried to get them to change and adapt to their culture, so they built these missions. And now today, we can see large cathedrals being located in Mexico. This one's in Mexico City. And these are usually located in the Zocalo, and the Zocalo is the main square of a large city. So this would be the Zocalo of Mexico City. Looking at economics in Mexico, there's always been a really large gap between the really, really rich people and the poor people in Mexico. They've been really trying hard to develop a modern industrial economy, because if you have an industrial economy, it will close that gap between the rich and the poor. Before the Industrial Revolution has been taking place in Mexico, it was largely an agricultural society. Also, with the Industrial Revolution hitting Mexico, we can see the population of cities on the rise, because we have urban locations and rural locations. And in the rural locations, we have a lot of agriculture. But now with the Industrial Revolution, we see more people moving towards the cities, and Mexico starts to become more of an urban area. The oil industry is another thing that is very large in Mexico, because we have the Gulf of Mexico where a lot of oil can be found. The profit from that oil business, because we know there's a lot of money in oil, the profit from the oil business has greatly increased the funding that can go towards the manufacturing industries. They're trying to get that sector of their country going, manufacturing, and oil provides the money to do that. Most of the current industries that are in Mexico are located north or near the United States border, and we call these maquiladoras. And these businesses that are along the border, they get imported materials, so things that aren't finished goods. You take materials and then you turn those into finished goods, and then they would sell them to people in the United States and in Canada. So they get the raw materials, or things that aren't fully put together, they put them together and then sell them. And they have a really easy way to sell them because they're part of NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement. This agreement between countries in North America, so Mexico, United States, and Canada, is an agreement signed by the governments of those three, creating kind of a three-way trading system in North America. This trade really helps all of them, and it really actually boosts all of their economies because they can trade freely and easily with each other. There are many problems that are still hitting Mexicans today, and immigration is one of them. Mexicans are often traveling to the United States in search of work, and that really separates a lot of their families. And I'm sure most of you have heard some of the immigration problems in the United States from people coming from Mexico. In the past, it was a big problem because they would leave at a really early age, and when they would leave Mexico, they would have no training or no education, and that made it really hard for them to find jobs in the United States. Lately, that trend has started to change a little bit, and now 85% of all the school-age children actually attend school in Mexico, something that wouldn't have been that way a long time ago. So that really wraps up the human geography section of Mexico, but now we're going to quickly look at the Caribbean and Central America. The first thing that you need to know is that Central America is an emis, or it's really a land bridge between North and South America, and you can see that on that map right there. Although it seems like it would be good for things such as trade, it actually led to some unrest early on in our nation's history. One of the reasons there was some unrest is because we had the Panama Canal being built, and that connected the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. One of the reasons it caused problems is because the United States wanted that canal to be built, but Colombia didn't want it to be built, and so there is some rest in that section. Like I talked about in Mexico, in Central America we also have the Mayans, who had their start there. They built temples and palaces where we have present-day Belize, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. The most important city for the ancient Mayans in Central America was Tikal, which is now Guatemala. As we talked about with Mexico, the Spanish took control of the Aztec people in Mexico, and that allowed them into Central America as well. So they came into Mexico, took over the Aztecs and the Mayans there, and then they saw an easy route into Central America. Once Mexico gained their independence, Central America was under their control until 1823, when they declared their own independence and became the United Provinces of Central America. The United Provinces of Central America eventually split by the late 1830s and all became separate nations. The Caribbean history is different from Central America. The Caribbean was settled by the Taino people before the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492. And remember, he didn't know where he was landing. He didn't know he was in the Caribbean. Columbus and his men attempted to force the Taino people into labor, like slaves, but many died from disease and mistreatment that Columbus brought. Replacing the Taino people as the slaves were the Africans, and now we have the African slaves. Thus we have a lasting African culture in the Caribbean. Most of the countries in the Caribbean had been claimed by larger powers in France and in other countries in Europe, but they were able to regain their independence. The larger powers like the Spanish, the French, and the British wanted these countries because they had a big ability to produce sugar. Haiti was the first one of these Caribbean countries to gain its independence, and they gained their independence from France. Cuba followed, gaining their independence from Spain, and Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago gained its independence from Great Britain. So that first they were taken over by these large European powers, but they were able to gain their independence from them. The culture in Central America is blended a lot like when we looked at Mexico, and it's blended between the Native American influences with the Spanish settlers, or the people that took them over. Spanish remains the dominant language, and Catholicism is the main religion in Central America. In the Caribbean, there's still a little hint of Europe remaining, like when those European countries came over and took over those countries, but otherwise it's still rich in African history. And remember, there'd be a lot of African culture because of the slaves that came over. The religions in the Caribbean are Catholic and Protestant, as well as Santeria, which is Catholicism mixed with African practices and rituals. We can also look at Rastafarianism, which is a religious and political movement practiced in Jamaica, and still have voodoo being practiced in Haiti. Looking at Central America and the Caribbean economically, you can see quite a big difference. Central America's population is very rural because agriculture is so big in that area. Mainly the growth of sugarcane is what is grown by the people in Central America. Trade is very important as well because if you remember back to the previous couple of slides, I talked about the Panama Canal. So they're really located in a good spot for trade, where the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean are linked. In the Caribbean, it's a little bit different because with Central America we have the rural locations. In the Caribbean, it's mainly urban. And one reason it's urban is because the main industry is tourism. Tourism allows people to have a lot of occupations, but it also leads to an informal economy. And an informal economy is people like shoe shiners or street vendors because they don't really have any benefits or any protection for their jobs, but they can still get money and make a living because of the tourism that is there. Quickly, a big thing in the Caribbean is music. We have calypso, which began in Trinidad, and that is like the steel drum music that you often hear there, and it has elements from Africa and Spain. And the one that you're very familiar with is reggae, which developed in Jamaica in 1960.